Well, good evening, and welcome back to the third of the 6 lectures in the 36th annual Winter Lecture Series. I'm Peter Levitoff, and I'm part of the steering committee, planning committee, organizing committee, whatever you want to call us. The Winter Lecture Series, as you probably know, is sponsored by the Social Action Committee of this Unitarian Church, and we also partner with OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute program. The program is funded in part by Humanities Nebraska and the Nebraska Cultural Endowment. There are a couple of things that I can remind you that the lectures will be available on the Unitarian Church website, usually a week to 10 days after they are delivered. The website is UnitarianLincoln, all one word, .org. And if bad weather seems to threaten the cancellation of a lecture, and so far so good, we're crossing our fingers, you can find out if it's going to be canceled by checking the website again. Our format, for those of you who have not been here, is we have a lecture of about an hour. We take a break for 15 minutes where we recess to the anteroom, the gathering room outside where there are refreshments. Help yourself. There's a little basket by each of the refreshments table. You're not paying for the refreshments, but if you'd like to give a donation, it will help the cause for future lectures. After the intermission, we'll flash the lights or ring a bell or something of the sort, and we'll reconvene for about 45 minutes of questions and comments. And we will conclude promptly at 9 o'clock as we promise. At this point, please silence your cell phones if you haven't done so already. Next week's lecture will be given by Professor Kelly Bauer of Nebraska Wesleyan, and the topic will be South American indigenous peoples, challenges and opportunities. This week's lecture is by Professor Sergio Wals, which in English is Sergio Wals, but we'll call him Sergio Wals because that's how I know him, how I've known him for about 10 years. And his topic is Mexico yesterday and today, democratic change and transnational challenges. I'll tell you a little bit about Professor Wals. He is Mexican. He received his what would be our bachelor's degree is the licenciatura from the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de Mexico in 2003. He then came to the United States as a graduate student and earned his master's and his doctorate degree from the University of Illinois. He then came immediately to the University of Nebraska as assistant professor in 2009, and he has progressed, been promoted, granted tenure. He's now associate professor of political science. His research interests are in the area of political behavior, including public opinion and political psychology. He's taught numerous courses on Mexico, on Latin America, on political behavior, polling, and what have you. Within the subfield of political behavior, he focuses on the relationship between democratization and individual perceptions of politics, as well as on topics related to immigration, race, and ethnicity, both in the United States and in Latin America. Professor Wals has won numerous teaching awards in the years he's been at the university. He's very active on committees within the department, within the university, and within professional associations. He's received a number of grants. He's been a visiting scholar back at his home university in Mexico, and he's quite an accomplished scholar. So without taking any more away from his time, give you Professor Sergio Wals.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight, and it's the second time I have the privilege to present to the Winter Series. It's been a while, but I see some friendly faces, and it's really nice to be back here. If I don't remember your name, and we've met I used to think that my memory was awesome. Uh, Apparently, years take a toll. So the topic today, honestly, it's the kind of topic that I enthusiastically said, yes, I'd love to talk about it. But the challenge was how to make it seamless for you. Uh, there are really three topics embedded in today's talk. You'll see them because that's the way it's structured. But each one of those could take, honestly, a one semester long course properly taught. So I may feel a little rushed at times, but I still want to give you a little bit of a feel of some of the, well, I call them cool anecdotes that I give my undergrads when I teach some of these topics at the University of Nebraska. But let's see how today goes. One thing that I need to say, I'm incredibly proud to be a member of the faculty at the University of Nebraska in the Department of Political Science, Institute for Ethnic Studies. But whatever I'm about to present here, that's why the Husker red N is right there. I'm proud. But whatever I present, that's my responsibility only. And I say that adamantly because nowadays, I just want to make sure people know if I say something, that's me, not the university. All right. So you got it. So a little bit of the roadmap for today. Mostly to, and if you can't hear me, I'm supposed to have a mic right here. Let me test it, because I tend to move a lot. Can you hear me well? No? I can do this. Don't worry about it. This is basically to keep myself on track, and so we all keep ourselves on track. There's three main components to today's talk. The first part is going to be a brief overview of Mexico's transition to democracy. The second component, talk a little bit about the challenge of accountability, democratic accountability in Mexico, because until recently, there's not been legislative consecutive reelection. And I'll go into depth on that matter quite a bit. And the last part, it's a little bit of the aftermath of the 2018 presidential elections and the road ahead. On that part is where I'm going to embed a little bit of the transnational challenges. Admittedly, nothing surprising, everything kind of speculative, tentative at this point, but also potentially the most contestable of these. So one of the things that is important to keep in mind, because for the longest time during the 40s, 50s, 60s, even internationally, Mexico was seen as an anomaly in Latin America in terms of regular elections and the lack of military coups or military leadership. And for the longest time, because of that, by contrast, it appeared to be a democracy. But Mexico was not a democracy during those days. Nowadays, it's exactly what we would call a hegemonic party regime. One party so dominant that really overpowered all of political life. And Mexico successfully transitioned to a democracy, a multi-party democracy, but it was a very long road. So I'm going to try to give you some key events, a key summary, just to understand it a little better. So just to give us a little bit of a sense, in 1929, so Mexico had a social revolution that ended up with a new constitution in 1917. I'll give you a little bit of a flash in a moment, but there was some democratic vibrancy from the end of the revolution, but there was a lot of chaos, political chaos. And by 1929, some of the still alive revolutionary leaders came together, formed a national coalition. They call it the National Revolutionary Party. And that basically became the one party that later down the road was that hegemonic party I talked about. In 1938, that same party just changed name, and it became the Mexican Revolution Party. The key change there was a little bit of the breaking of one of the original leaders with the sitting president of the country. And that was basically the main thing. But there was a key change, which was they started incorporating unions into the basis, like officially into the basis of the party. 1939, in response to the increasingly, and on this one, you know, it depends whom you ask, and some people get upset at me when I say it like this, but hey. That party started looking a lot more like a socialist party. Without being a socialist party, it started looking like one. And there was a response from some sectors, some university professors, some small business owners, some Catholic active members in the political elites that founded the National Action Party in 1939. And by 1946, the PRM became the Institutional Revolutionary Party, changing its name again. And the main change here was not a breakup with elites or among elites. It was the fact that it became a mostly civilians party. Remember that this party was formed after a social revolution, and there was a heavy component of the military embedded in it. By 1946, it's mostly civilians, and they basically expelled the military component from the party. And I know it sounds strange to call it the institutionalized revolution, the revolutionary party. Revolutions are meant to break institutions. They had this kind of like identity crisis for the longest time. That's not a translation issue. I can assure you that. And then there's quite a bit of a jump. In 1988, there's an important division of the elites. Mainly on ideological basis, but also because of power-grabbing, situations. And a former PRI politician decides to run against the PRI with a left-wing coalition. And that's one of the most contested elections that Mexico's contemporary history has recorded. Some still claim that there was fraud. I'm not going to enter into that unless you have some Q&A. I have a particular vision on that. I'm happy to share, but it's irrelevant to the content of the rest of the talk. The important part for the rest of the talk is that in 1989, the losers of that election that formed that left-wing coalition decided to form a left-wing political party called the Democratic Revolution Party, the PRD. And those next 11 years were intense years of electoral competition at all levels in Mexico. At all levels. It's like for the first time, some governorships are won by the opposition until there's this dominoes effect until finally in 2000, the PRI loses the presidential race and the National Action Party candidate, even though he won in a coalition, he was the winner. By 2014, and I just happened to mention this briefly, as you can tell, the first three logos of the parties, I wanted to give you a sense of the logos just for, I have found that it's easier to remember things if you have an image there. They're lumped together, and the reason for that is because even though the PRI and the PAN were founded relatively at this, like close in history, in historic terms, the PRD, they became the three main parties of the Mexican system. And in the last election, which we will talk about a little bit, they basically crumbled. The last one, which started as a movement of national regeneration, therefore in Spanish, those initials, Morena, that acronym, they won in a landslide election. And shortly after that election, public opinion polls showed that basically loyalty to the main three parties, the main three historic parties, was in the single digits for each one of them. So I'll get to that one, but the reason I'm separating that, I'm not discriminating against them, I'm not trying to be judgmental in any way, I'm just saying they're a separate story that may or may not really change the configuration of Mexican politics for the long, for the time to come. I'm gonna start moving just a little, so hopefully the mic picks me up, and if not, I'll come back here in just a moment. Let me see, if not, I can try to, can you hear me very well? No?
Just need to turn on the thing in the pocket.
Oh. Thing in your pocket.
Oh, so, technology, of course. I had to just,
Well, you're They're new, so we're all getting used to it. There we go.
All right. Let's see. Let's exit that. Let's see. Can you hear me? Oh, now this is gonna pick up some. Okay, let's see. I'm gonna feel a little freer now. Sorry, just I get really anxious even when I'm teaching. Thank you. So that figure, the reason I bring it is it helps me year after year when I teach Latin American politics to my students. Helps me try to tell a story. And the story is the following. Please do not get lost on the details other than there's a few numbers. On this y-axis, what you have is a scale that runs from -10 to +10, -10 being low, +10 being up. And the figure runs from 1945, the end of World War II, to 2015. That's just public data available to everybody. If you Google this, you'll find the same thing. The reason I like it is because it's public data and it's reliable data. So my students can check that I'm not giving them fake news or fake data for that matter. And the other reason it's important is because you may disagree with the measurement, but once you tell the story, they realize that, okay, there might be better measurements here or there, but the story seems to hold. The story seems to reflect in that figure. And here's the main takeaway. As you can tell, Mexico runs 1945 all the way to 1975. I would like to tell you that it's because I was born on that year that things started changing in the country, but I had nothing to do with that. But it runs at a -6. And what that says, forget about the specifics of the number, is that Mexico was an authoritarian regime. Now, it's not a -10. It's not a military junta. It's not a sole dictatorship. The reason it's not a -10 is because Mexico had regular elections. That's what made it so difficult to classify at the time. Now, as I said, it was called, we know it as a hegemonic party regime. But there were constant elections, and elections did matter. People can quibble about this, but elections did matter for a number of reasons that are a little beyond the scope of the lecture, but I'm happy to talk a little more about it in just a moment. But what you start seeing in 1977 is a jump up. There is where the transition to democracy, at least in terms of this scale, starts. What happened? As I said, not that I was born, although that's true and accurate. In 1976, just to paint a picture here, there was a very fun fact. There's a presidential race. Wanna guess how many people are running? Anybody? Any takers? One. And this hasn't happened in a while. But how did it come about? Well, basically, you know how I told you the story of how the parties formed? Well, the PRI was very clever and eventually co-opted other relatively minor parties. I don't want to offend anybody if they had that affiliation, but they were relatively minor. One was the Popular Socialist Party. Yes, Popular Socialist Party. The other one was the Authentic Party of the Mexican Revolution. But they somehow managed to nominate the exact same presidential candidate for a while. Every time that the presidential races came about, they coalesced, they produced one candidate. So the only true opposition for the longest time, and some people get really mad at me when I say that, I'll stand by it. It was the National Action Party. People may not have agreed with them or not, that's a different matter, but they were a true opposition. And in 1976, they had a big dilemma in front of them. And that was, should we keep this facade or not? Because we don't stand a chance of winning. They almost broke as a party. They had this big debate about party or country. I don't want to say anything else about that because people get very sensitive nowadays. So I'm talking about Mexico, I'm talking about 1976. But they had a big debate about party or country, and they decided that country mattered more.
and they decided not to run. They decided to win by losing. And what they decided to do was very important, because basically at the end of the electoral journey, the results were 100% of the votes, of the official votes, went to the ruling party. And this is 1976. You may recall that there was something called the Cold War. And you may recall that we usually kind of like didn't like, we kind of frowned over kind of socialist regimes and communist regimes and whatnot. And winning an election with 100% sounded a lot like that. And this is the country that's immediately south of the United States. So there was a transnational component to that decision, kind of trying to denounce to the international community, are you sure this is a democracy? Are you sure you want to keep backing this up? Anyways, because of this, there's these political reforms that came about. And I'm not going to lie to you. Some people say they're fundamental, and they are, but true change was very slow. The figure kind of picks it up. I mean, from a -6, it went to a -2. Okay, yes, it's a big jump in the scale, but still within the authoritarian side, correct? Now, you'll see that there comes about another set of changes right around 1988. And remember what I started telling you about that time? There was another presidential race right around then. And on that one is when the elites of the PRI split, mostly on ideological basis. You may or may not remember, so bear with me here, the late 1980s, the world is seeing something of a push from the Reagan administration, the Thatcher administration, the World Bank, IMF, etc., for some kind of different policies, economic policies. Mexico is not an exception. And Mexico has started to kind of like push for less interventionist of a state. And there's a number of reasons for that, but what is important here is that at the ideological level of the elite of the ruling party, some people were not happy about that. They saw that as an imposition from the outside. They saw that as an imposition from the United States. And whether or not that was right or wrong, that's for you to decide, that caused a big split. And the person actually, the most visible person splitting from the PRI is no less than the son of a former president of Mexico. Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, the son of General Lázaro Cárdenas, the general that turned the PNR into the PRM, was not happy with the direction of the party. But of course, also, I may say, and you know, if by any chance him or one of his followers listens to this, they may disagree with me. I'm still wanting to advance that. He also wanted power. And he also thought it was his time, and his party was not giving him his time. So he looked for a different avenue. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to do for a politician. I mean, that's what they do. I mean, I don't blame them for that. I just study them. So he runs. There's this very contested election. And some people say there was big fraud. Again, I'm not going to get caught on that. There's arguments there was, there wasn't. I can go back to that in the Q&A. Perfectly happy. But what happens here is the country really realizes, and by that I mean several actors, that more political reforms need to come about. And they do, especially in the mid-90s. Mexico really takes on some really big institutional changes. And some of them having like an independent, civilian, non-partisan elections institute to organize and qualify and decide who the winners are, to allocate public budgets to parties so they can compete in more fair basis. There's even the institutionalization of an ID. And when I talk about voters' ID nowadays, people get really like, don't do that. Well, let me tell you this because This is one of the reasons I love my job. I make everybody unhappy. And that's why I'm happy I'm not a politician, because then I would never be reelected. See, like, I have always said in Mexico it was a great thing, the advent of that voter's ID. And some people say, well, it wouldn't work here. I don't know. That I don't know. Let me tell you a couple of features. Well, there was fraud. In Mexico, there was fraud at the time, right? And one way in which they secured that this wouldn't happen was having this voter's ID. And these IDs happen to be more secure than passports. And they're free. And people that never had voices or access to IDs because they cannot afford a car, now they had access to these free IDs. And they could go to a bank and have some kind of personality to banks and other institutions. So, I mean, in Mexico, at the very least, at the time, worked out like a charm. It was very well done. So by 95, you'll see that there's another big jump. And that's the outcome of all of those changes of a civilian elections institute and also these IDs, a number of changes. But also, just to give you a sense, some people would say, well, why did transition not occur then? Well, institutions are not enough. 94 was a very difficult year, very difficult year. Presidential candidate of the PRI gets shot in the head, actually in the head and the torso. Original report said 2 different calibers, and then eventually was one single shooter. But hey, don't ask me. I don't know, and I'm on public record, so it was one single shooter. So, bless you. So, one of the key features after that is the PRI still won, but some more changes came about. And by 97, for the first time, the PRI loses congressional control. And then more changes come about. There's a cascade of changes. By 2000, for the first time, the PRI loses the presidency in 70 years. I cannot tell you how big that day was, July 2nd of 2000. And I wish I could tell you that I still don't get excited about it, but I do. I just felt like literally she was running through me. I was working, of all places, at the president's office. I saw the change from inside. And at some point, I actually snuck out to go to the streets and to celebrate what just happened. I'll try to share this with you in just a moment. After those changes, you'll see that very steadily Mexico scores at an 8 out of 10. Not a perfect democracy, but a democracy nonetheless. That's an actual picture of July 2nd, 2000. Not while the speech took place, but a little after the fact, somewhere in that crowd, my brother and I were out there. And it's always fun to go back and see some of this imagery, for me anyways. So that's a little bit of the context of a very long path to democracy. A long path that took a lot of efforts, a lot of minds, like a lot of actors. No one can ever claim that they were the heroes of Mexican democracy because it took a lot of generations and a lot of factors involved, a lot of compromises. And I want to convey a little bit that to you. Now, one of the difficulties is once this transition occurred, the transition of power, there was very little accountability because one of the key features of the hegemonic party was that legislatures could not run for office in consecutive terms. So, let me introduce you to this very quickly. The current Constitution of Mexico, a little over 100 years old, was officialized February 5th of 1917. In that original constitution, in the original text, even though they just came out of this social revolution that, debunked the dictatorship of General Porfirio Diaz, they did not want presidents to be reelected for that reason, but they did not touch the legislative branch. However, in 1933, I'll remember a name that I just mentioned to you, General Lázaro Cárdenas? Okay, So I know I get into a lot of trouble, but kind of like he's not in power yet, but he's a very powerful player along with others. And these guys kind of like try to put together a constitutional amendment to make sure that legislatures cannot run for office in consecutive terms. What does that do? Well, basically it makes legislators kind of like irrelevant to constituents, and if they want a job, they need to be very party oriented. And in the case of a hegemonic party, they need to be very oriented to the president of the country. So this is just for fun, just to show you a few images to give your brain a little break. On your left, and that's funny, on your left you have General Porfirio Diaz, who really liked right-wing policies. That's why that's funny. And yes, I did it on purpose. And in the center, there's one of the heroes of the Mexican Revolution, the political revolution anyways, that wanted democracy, but who ran for the presidency under the motto, effective suffrage, no re-election. I know, some of you are scratching your heads like, wait a second. So effective suffrage, no re-election. Yes, that was the motto. Oh, and by the way, ironies of history, that guy on the left, not really, but on the left in your images here, that guy ascension to power came about with embracing those principles too, earlier in his political career, and then he went on to be a dictator. You know, politicians. What are we gonna do? But the other thing is, we have here, it's one of the beautiful paintings, murals, that you can see in Mexico City if you ever have a chance to go visit. And that's depicting Francisco y Maderos, the guy in the center, this political hero of the Mexican Revolution, depicting his entry to Mexico City, triumphant. And if you can read, in that red banner at the top of that mural, it literally says, sufragio efectivo, no reelección. Effective suffrage, no re-election. It was deeply ingrained in the political culture. And this is one of the ways in which I tried to convey it. So that looks funny. That didn't look like that in my computer, but anyways. So let me just, for the point here, for decades, the PRI tried to make the case to the Mexican public that re-election was bad. And historically speaking, you know, like when you were a kid and you were socialized and in your history classes, you know, you're 9, 10 years old and they tell you, hey, General Diaz reelected once and again, become this horrible dictator, re-election is bad. You know, a lot of the kids end up drinking the Kool-Aid. Not everybody is fortunate enough to go on to a great university like I did, get fantastic history professors that kind of like question these things with facts and made us think harder about it. I was also exposed to some of the professors that were leading the charge in transforming those institutions. A couple of them actually were part of those civilians in charge of the Elections Institute. And those were the professors that we looked up to. So I honestly have the privilege to say I belong to a generation that saw democracy in the making from really close. So this idea that re-election was a bad thing for democracy, that's an argument that didn't fly with some people in my generation, but it really mattered if you were educated or not, really well educated or not. So just to, for the sake to keep the pace, basically here, what happened after the 2000 defeat of the PRI, people started the debate again. Do we need to have legislative re-election or not? In a nutshell, it didn't happen. And one of the reasons is because public opinion was against it. We have measurable public opinion polls, and I'll show you a little bit of data about it in just a moment, that said, no, that is not a good thing. And of course, politicians tend to take a pulse, and if it's something, even if it's the right thing to do, well, what did I do? Okay, I didn't do anything. That's the problem, I didn't do anything. Okay, so let me do one more. There was an attempt in 2005 to amend the Constitution It seemed that it was going well, but then the PRI in the Senate blocked it. They still were the largest group in the Senate, powerful institution, and it stopped change right there. That is just an image for you. That is how the Chamber of Deputies, the equivalent of the Congress, the House of Representatives, looks like in Mexico City. That's the inner part. And I had a professor who may rest in peace, who said that usually the way the buildings were designed, told you a lot about the nature of the political system. I think he was onto something, and that's why I chose this. There's 500 Congress people in Mexico. So there's more Congress people in Mexico than there are in the United States. I highlight that because the United States has almost triple the population that Mexico does. And yet there's more representatives at the lower level. I also get in trouble a lot for saying I think some of them should not be there. I mean, that's a waste of public's money, but that's just my opinion. Mine, not the University of Nebraska's. It's mine. So here, as you can tell, there's this luxury, but also there's a little bit of a sense of we're in one of them. It's almost like a house of worship. What's interesting is that at the very top, the most important event that ever takes place in this house is the State of the Union address. When the president tells Congress how the country is doing. And that tends to be the most visible event in this place. And I think this place was kind of like built to enhance the presidential power over Congress. That's a little bit of my opinion. Certainly not what our founders had in mind. Article 1, as far as I remember, longest in our Constitution, devoted to Congress. But it's a little different there. Okay. So, some of the recent developments. Here's the good news, hopefully. But there's good news and bad news. Finally, in 2014, after all these years, finally, there was a constitutional reform, and it was approved, so legislators can run for office with some restrictions, but they can run in consecutive terms. So let me tell you about it. So federal deputies can run for office up to 4 consecutive times, so they cannot stay in Congress forever, just 4 consecutive times, and terms there are not 2 years, but 3 years. Senators can elect themselves up to 2 terms, so senators here in the United States would be very disappointed because this is only 2, just twice the right. And terms there are also 6 years for senators. Now, the first cohort that can re-elect themselves is coming up. They were elected in 2018, and they would have an opportunity for the federal deputies to be re-elected in 2021, for senators in 2024. If it only would be linear. But no, it's politics and it's history, and nothing is as simple as that. Remember that I told you that this recent election had a lot of changes? That the main parties kind of crumbled and that there was a new kid in town? Well, the senators from that new party haven't even taken the oath of office yet. And they were already saying, remember that re-election thing? Has to go. Because it's anti-democratic. And this is the newly elected guys that are supposed to be the hope for democracy. And like, no, that thing has to go. And of course, people like myself, and on this one again, not the University of Nebraska, here, me, Sergio Wals, yeah, I'm still scratching my head. I do not understand it. But thankfully, it gives me, as a social scientist, an opportunity for some research. And I'm engaged in some really cool research with some colleagues at the university and in Mexico around the topic. So let me try to give you a little bit of that. Remember I told you about public opinion polls earlier today about this issue on legislative re-election? Let me show you a little bit of this. So all you have to see here, like the red bars, I know, I'm the first one to be chanting, go big red. In this case, the red is not a good thing, okay? But just for right now, That's a strong disagreement with legislative re-election in consecutive terms. I have 3 different points in time, 2002, 2003, 2004, on the left, that show you what was the context shortly after Vicente Fox won the presidency and the PRI lost for the first time in 70 years. And as you can tell, it's fairly stable. There's very strong, like if you look at the red bars, they're well into the 40s levels, and then the orange bars, that's still disagreement, and they are roughly around the 20 marker, which means that give or take a solid 60% of the country was in disagreement with re-election, right? So this is one of the reasons politicians were a little scared about going against public opinion. Recently, my colleagues and I measured this again in 2018, and it looked apparently worse. I know there's just a small shift, but enough that if you follow me, look at the red bar. The red bar actually it's as high as it has ever been. The orange bar is as high as it has ever been, which means that disagreement is at its highest. And what we don't know if it was an effect of the reform of the Constitution that people started feeling, we said we don't want it, and now you're going after this. That part we don't know. But in 2018, it seems like things, even if slightly, but they may have gone worse. And of course, then Morena, said, hey, we're not going to let this happen. And people like myself concerned about the wrong institutional move for Mexico want to make an argument not in partisan terms, no, not myself, in the most objective terms. We came up with an idea. And it is because we've seen data from before, and it looks very different depending upon how you ask it. So let me walk you through this one, because this is part of a book chapter that was just released in a book that's about to be presented in Mexico. It's available online. The bad thing, it's not been translated to English yet. I may try to work with the University of Nebraska Press just to see if I can kind of encourage them to do that. But in the meantime, let me show you the data. This is a book chapter that I co-wrote with a colleague of mine, who also happens proudly to be my wife, and one of our former students at UNL, who's now a professor on his own right. So very, very cool stuff for me anyways. The thing that says no framing, it's a question when we just asked, do you oppose or favor legislative re-election? And as you can tell, overwhelmingly people say, I disagree with re-election. But then what happens when you add what we call vignettes that allow us to study framing effects, or how we present things to the public may matter. And just by the way, this is something that politicians are really good at, trying to frame things in a way that looks more appealing to us all. And a lot of times we buy that. So in this case are positive frames. These are not negative frames. One says, would you like this or oppose this if it would mean a more professional Congress, more professional members of Congress? So when you prompt professionalization, what you see is that the red bar goes really low, the orange bar still hangs tight, but now the yellow bar, which is agreement, and the green bar are the ones that are at least half and half. Now you have the public at the very least half and half. The same if you ask people about what if this would mean more accountability? What if these legislators would be more accountable to you? Which is part of the whole notion of having re-election in consecutive terms. And as you can tell on that one, it really flies with the Mexican people. That's the one that gets the most traction. People are desperate to have some kind of accountability with their authorities. And it's just they don't know that re-election can do that. And then checks and balances. Checks and balances seems to work a little bit too. Not as well as accountability, but still very well. Now, the main takeaway from this figure, it's not to get lost in the numbers, but it's just to show that even though there's a seemingly relatively stable opposition to legislative re-election, you could even say like a culture of no re-election in Mexico, when we get past that, when we studied it more scientifically, which is the whole purpose of us, according to our state senators spending the big bucks in our university, what we need to do is kind of like give something back. And I think this gives a little something back. We are trying to show that, look, if this new elected government says that they are going to be the voice of the people, and because they're being the voice of the people, they don't want to have re-election, that they can get away with it unless somebody tells the people, look, it depends. When you are asked in under different circumstances, you think differently. And that's the whole point of this study and the follow-ups that we have planned. So one of the main concerns we have is that when we conducted more nuanced analysis on these databases, the shadow of corruption is the one thing that doesn't let people like really give themselves into it. And basically what you see is even when they believe that this would become, this would make legislators more accountable, they're worried that it could increase corruption. Why? Because politicians have a bad rap. So now I'm gonna give them the power to stay in power even though they're corrupt? Like, I wanna believe that there's gonna be enhanced accountability, but at the same time, I have to battle the image of, if they're corrupt, why would I want them to stay there, right? So there's a lot of work to be done there, and I'm hoping to spearhead some efforts with my colleagues down there, with some funding from the US, some funding from Mexico, and hope that before it's too late, hopefully we can educate enough of the public that that tragedy, institutional tragedy anyways, happens. So the aftermath, and I'm trying to keep very tight look on the clock. What I have here is I presented you a little bit of what I consider anyways, the biggest challenge to democracy and democratic accountability in Mexico. This idea of re-election, and that even the senators now, there's an impasse a little bit, but they were pushing for trying to get rid of that, and I hope they don't. And if they do, I hope that the debate takes into account opinions like yours truly. To that effect, actually, that is the cover of a book which I proudly co-edited with 2 colleagues in Mexico. It's just coming out. It's available online nowadays. And it's about the electoral turn in Mexico. There's a lot of really good chapters in there. I'm gonna give you just bits and pieces to give you a sense of why this election might be so consequential for today's days. And from there, some of the challenges we'll touch on the transnational arena. So I'm sorry for the acronym right off the bat, but you're gonna find that even in a newspaper in the United States. The full name of this guy, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, it's too much for Americans to handle. Like if I gave you my full name in Mexico, it would be even more because it's actually longer. It's Sergio Carlos Wals Aparicio. I have 2 names and I have 2 last names. We have the father's last name, the mother's last name. But this guy, and the newspapers loved it, kind of these initials kind of clicked, and nowadays he's AMLO. And so he's the winner of the 2018 presidential election, and he won a landslide election. I mean, some politicians all over the globe are drooling over these numbers. Trust me when I tell you this. This is a multi-party system, guys, because it's easy to win 50% of the vote when there's only 2 choices. It's a lot harder to do that when you have 6 or 7 choices, even if some of them are combined in electoral coalitions. This guy won with his coalition over the 50% of the popular vote, and he carried 31 of the 32 states of Mexico. It's not like his victory was concentrated in the south, the north, the west, the east. No, it didn't matter. This guy just beat them up everywhere. There's no way anybody could have made an argument, no, but it was those Southerners, oh, it was those Northerners, it was those, no, it was everywhere. And when you analyze the data, all cohorts, age-wise, education-wise, it was just a sweep. As I'm saying to you, politicians all over the globe are drooling over how did he do that? Because I'm pretty sure they would love to do that. I think there's a combination of factors, but one of them is mostly people in Mexico were really, really upset, dismayed with the whole notion that people in power just don't listen. And, you know, after 18 years of democracy, that's an elusive concept to most folks. And there's been kind of lack of results here or there, and there's been violence here and there, and it just got tough. I think he was a very smart politician. I personally, for disclosure, I don't like him, but I'm always very objective. He was very smart. He rode a very interesting wave, historic anyways, and he knew how to pitch his message, not just to the right audience. He pitched it to just about every segment of the population. And this is one of the things that I think hopefully my students appreciate it. I disclose, when I have a strong feeling, I disclose it, but I can remain objective. This guy, I personally don't like him, and I know I'm going in public record, but I still can appreciate the intelligence that he had to ride the wave and just run a winning campaign. Now his party controls the Senate. 77 senators out of 128. Not all of them are from his party, but they are from the electoral coalition that gave him the victory. And then in the Chamber of Deputies, he has 336 out of 500. And if you're doing the math right, yes, he pretty much can run the country. There's no possibility of opposition of any kind. To make things worse, from a democratic perspective, if this guy were not to be a good guy, and I'm hoping and praying that he is, the thing is, he has the highest levels of presidential approval recorded in Mexico since the early 90s. Like 70-some% approve of him. And he's remained steady on presidential approval after quite a bit in the presidency now. Some of the lessons that we learned from public opinion data in this election is that 7 out of 10 Mexican citizens expressed that their opinions do not matter to the political elites. I'm just citing at the end the last name of the contributors to the book that I co-edited, and that both millennials, those famous millennials, and older cohorts share this negative view of government. So it's not, like what's fascinating here, it's not just the young people that are disappointed with democracy, which that's the only game they've known. It's the old people that knew authoritarian alternatives, experienced the shift to democracy, and now they're still dismayed. 5 out of 10 Mexican citizens agree that democracy is the best form of government, but 1 out of 3, and that's not a small number, 1 out of 3 thinks that Mexican democracy has severe problems. And there's weaker partisan ties and identities, like I explained to you. Like some of the most recent public opinion polls show that intention to vote for the older, like status quo, 3 main parties is in the single digits. That's problematic for a party system. And of course, what about populism? That word that we've heard so much recently. Well, the authors of one of the chapters in the book say that it's not too bad. Thankfully, at least with the data we have thus far, in Mexico, populist attitudes, they exist and they're widespread, but they're not related to nativist or authoritarian attitudes thus far. So hopefully not more to come, but that's what I can report for now. A majority of Mexicans associate democracy with freedom of the press, free and fair elections, and minority rights, all well and good. But they also associate it with the creation of new jobs. And I'm sorry to say it, but what does democracy have ever to do with the creation of new jobs? I know politicians love saying, if you elect me, I'll give you new jobs. I know they say that. And that's a good way to get votes. But democracy, and the founders here can back me up anytime, is not about creating jobs. Anyways, there's evidence of increased acceptance of authoritarian alternatives. Like when you ask, hey, would it be okay under certain circumstances that the military runs this or that? And there's not troublesome yet, but problematic. And by the way, I don't have the specific number top of my head, but just as a warning, and I'm happy to look up the link for my friends here. Guys, not so long ago, and I'm not meaning like this is pre-2016 election, because there was a poll that indicated that about 14% of Americans would be okay with the military running certain things. So I'm happy to, this is off topic, but I'm happy to look for the link. And so you see that this is a phenomenon that more and more is increasing throughout the world. It's not just happening in Latin American democracies. And well, I have to end at least this part with saying that the systematic migration of Mexican citizens to the United States, that's a challenge to Mexico. That's a challenge to Mexican democracy. Most people think, well, that's a challenge just in economic terms. My research strongly suggests that that's a hit to political capital. People that end up coming here have what I came to term political suitcases, and they have strong political suitcases. And the tragedy for these folks is that they're really not engaged there, where they're so desperately needed. And when they come here, if they're lucky, they're going to spend about 15 years before they can really vote. Hey, I came here legal means, done everything by the book. I arrived in this country that I love so much, 2004. I'm a proud American citizen. I swore allegiance July 15 of 2016. I'll never forget that. My family was there. One of the greatest blessings I've ever seen. But even to me, it took almost 12 years to achieve that. So, just food for thought. This is a little bit of data that I wanted to show you very quickly about public opinion polls I've conducted with another colleague of mine, asking Mexican citizens whether or not they would like to come to the United States within the next 2 or 3 years. For different reasons, I'm not showing you the most recent data, but I'm showing you data up to 2012. So the re-election year for President Barack Obama. The green, the lowest bar that's green, that in this screen looks the same green as the other green, which shouldn't be the case, and I'm sorry about that. That's the people that say that they're very likely to come. Here's the good news and here's the bad news. The good news is that follows the market. If the economy in the United States is doing well, more people want to come. If the economy in the United States is not doing well, people don't want to come. So good news, because that's enough of a deterrent. Bad news for Mexico, on any given point, you have a solid, roughly 4% of the population that expresses interest in coming here. Now the kicker is they don't really want to stay. But we can talk about that later in the Q&A. So, of course, the transnational challenges, and here, look, this is on purpose. I have 2 or 3 minutes left. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm not here to make people angry. But one of the things that we need to think about, at least for me anyways, as a social scientist, is there might be effects of the US immigration policy, and there might be effects of the 2018 US election to immigration flows. How? I'm not sure yet. And unlike other people, I'm not willing to advance things unless I have hard data at hand. And for me right now, I can see these things going both ways. So, but I had to mention. And one thing that I wanted to share is that in another one of my projects, this one with a very dear colleague, Beth Theis-Morse, another grad student that is now a professor of his own right at the University of Arizona, Frank Gonzalez, former student of mine who went on to be a lawyer. So she's probably much better off than I am, making a lot more money than I am. Good for her, but she was also part of the project. And we published something about attitudes towards transnational policies in Mexico in 2015. And our study was very simple, but what we showed is that transnational attitudes in Mexico, immigration policy included, attitudes towards NAFTA, all of those were highly driven by a concept that we call trust in foreigners. And of course, we incorporated trust in Americans there, a measure of trust in Americans. And, you know, the story is very simple. The more trust you have in foreigners, whether you interact with them or not, whether they're just a concept in your head or not, the more open you're about immigration. And the more open you're about international trade. But if you trust them less, that all goes away. It's a very simple story, but very powerful, especially nowadays. Because what's happening in the world is we start seeing a dip in people trusting people from other nationalities. And, you know, we have Brexit as an example, and we have different, I'm not saying this is just happening in the United States, but for the case of North America, we'll see how that plays out. But my fear is that less trust may lead to more complicated relationships in a region that, you know, historically already had some complications of its own. And as I said, it's still hard to predict how much damage there will be among Mexicans regarding their levels of trust in Americans in the post-Trump era. This one, just straightforward. I mean, there's been a direct calling of Mexico, and let me just give you a sense. The PRI president, the outgoing president, the guy that lost big in the 2018 election, still welcomed President Trump as a president-elect candidate. I'm pretty sure he paid a price for that. Whether that was the right thing or not to do, I'm not asking you to think this or that. I'm just saying these strategic politicians on both sides of the border have incentives to do what they do. But they can pay the costs, and on paying those costs, unfortunately, sometimes they just pass on the cost to us. Enough of that. Some of the final remarks before I go to the Q&A with you guys. So what should we take away from today? And I hope you take some. Mexico experienced a very long transition to democracy. I hope no one ever tells you that that was like a magic thing that happened overnight, that in 2000 Mexico was ready and boom. No, nothing is farthest from the truth. Mexico experienced a very long path to democracy, and a lot of generations worked really hard for it. And I do hope that the current administration in Mexico takes that to heart, and that the future generations of Mexico keep working to preserve that democracy. I'm a firm believer of democracy. Might not be perfect, but I still think it's worth fighting for. And just when we thought it was here to stay, there are some troublesome indicators. There's immediate challenges to democratic consolidation in Mexico that include increased dismay among the public with democracy, that there was a complete overhaul with the old political party system. We don't know how it's going to look like 3 years from now, 4 years from now, 10 years from now. There's potential increased support for charismatic leaders and authoritarian ways. And on this one, I mean, honestly, I really hope it wasn't the case. But we always need to keep an eye on that one. And, you know, I know that the US government has had a history of also liking good dictators. I'm not unaware of that. But I would really hope that we're serious about backing democratic leaders, especially this close. And systematic loss of political capital due to migration, to me, that one's the toughest challenge for Mexico. Because politicians in Mexico don't have any incentive to stop that. Hey, I'm a social scientist. Why don't they have an incentive? Very simple. People that live in the United States that send money to Mexico, on any given year, the dollar amount that comes from the United States to Mexico, it's either the first or the second source of income of dollars revenue. Some years it even tops revenue for oil. So, just two slight thoughts here. One of the reasons they do is because they have people behind. They left people behind. I know that all too well because I had lived it myself. So sometimes when we think about immigration reform, I have always said, politicians look at this wrong, my opinion. And part of that is because they don't look at the incentives of the long term. Part of the incentives of the long term would be, hey, what can we do so that money stays and gets reinvested in the United States? Now that's gonna cause a whole lot of trouble for Mexico if that ever happens. But there's ways to do it in a way that it's possible for people to do it in a nice way and offer them a nice way to stay and bring the ones they love and give a boost to the economy. Why do they not talk in those terms? Beats me. I'm not an economist either, so maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. And there are substantive transnational challenges during the Trump administration, and it's reasonable to still expect them afterwards. Whether it's just next year or 4 more years, that we will see soon enough. With that, I would like to stop, just thanking you for your, just having me here today and looking forward to your questions. And thank you very much.
Okay, we'll come back here about 20 after 8. It's about 7 or 8 after, so like